You are listening to Climate Now. I'm Catherine Warman.
And I'm James Lawler.
One of the major hurdles for investment and implementation of new technologies is policy.
Unfortunately, in order to slow down climate change, things like rebuilding our current infrastructure to support new technologies like hydrogen fuel, bioenergy, and carbon capture need support from policymakers to get off the ground, namely in the form of some price on carbon.
Our guest for this episode is Dr. Danny Richter, the Vice President of Governmental Affairs at the Citizens Climate Lobby, a nonprofit, nonpartisan grassroots advocacy organization focused on national policies to address climate change. He holds a PhD in oceanography from UC San Diego and has been with Citizens Climate Lobby since 2013. Dr. Richter, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So, Danny, we start with the same question first for all of our guests. How did you get where you are? What's your journey been?
Yeah, my story is pretty linear. I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to be a medical doctor to help people. I thought that would be the best way that I could save lives. And then got to college, took a geology class, and realized the potential that the natural world had to make people sick if not properly called for. And so I came to view taking care of the environment as a really the most fundamental form of public health you could possibly do. If being a doctor is putting on the Band-Aid, public health is removing the need to put on a Band-Aid in the first place. And so I wanted to do public health on the grandest scale. And so looking at the suite of environmental problems that were there, climate change seemed like the one that had the potential to make the most people sick. At the time, I thought that the best thing to do was to convince people. I found the study of paleoclimate, that's paleo old climate of the past, the most convincing. So I thought, I don't know exactly what I want to do, but I'll get a PhD in that. And then as I've been convinced, I can convince other people. That led me to my PhD in oceanography, made it to all 7 continents, being paid to do scientific research around the world. And while I was there, I came to the conclusion, we don't need more research. We need to start acting. I started volunteering with Citizens Climate Lobby. While I was in grad school, I was a volunteer for 5 years, and eventually they said, hey, maybe we should pay Danny. And so I was willing to move away from my wife and from my family, move to DC, and that was 2013. I've been here ever since. So that's my journey.
Your work focuses on the policy levers that exist that might help us transition away from fossil fuels, such as carbon tax, cap and trade, fee and dividend. Can you walk us through the major policy levers that exist, and then we'll dive into one in particular?
Sure. I'll run through. I'll do my best. So the first idea you mentioned is a carbon tax, and actually the first 3 ideas: carbon tax, cap and trade, and fee and dividend. These are all types of carbon price. And carbon price is what economists and scientists say is the most important thing we can do. In fact, they say that it is essential to have some sort of carbon price for ambitious climate policies. And that was in the IPCC report on a 1.5 degree world. So those first 3 items, those are all different types of the essential policy. And so let's break down those first 3. Carbon tax. This is the idea of just putting a tax on fossil fuels based on how many greenhouse gas emissions will result when they are burned. That way, you're putting a tax on the pollution that is causing the problem in proportion to its contribution to the problem. The nice thing about a carbon tax is that you can very easily implement it, and you can very easily disincentivize around 80% of emissions in the United States with one policy. The next one you mentioned was cap and trade. Again, this is also a type of carbon price. And the purpose of the cap in cap and trade is to limit emissions by setting a price that companies would pay for the greenhouse gas emissions. All cap and trade systems that have actually been implemented have some kind of safety valve or are paired with offsets. So the cap is really only used to arrive at a price for permits to pollute. Those permits can then be traded. That's where the trade comes in cap and trade among polluters. And the idea is that the trading will lead to a more efficient, and by that I mean lower cost reductions in emissions, and that spares consumers. These systems have generally been limited to the power sector, which is 27% of emissions in the United States, for example, though some systems are working on expanding to the transportation sector. The third carbon price that you mentioned at the beginning is fee and dividend. This is more specifically a kind of carbon tax. Carbon tax, that term doesn't tell you anything about how the revenue will be used, but the term fee and dividend does. The proposal and the bills that we have long advocated for at Citizens Climate Lobby have a 100% dividend. So 100% of the revenue raised from the fee would be returned back to households as a monthly cashback or dividend. And because the government doesn't keep any of the money, it is most correctly termed a fee instead of a tax. Taxes raise revenue for the government. So if you return all of it, if the government doesn't earn money on that, it is most properly called a fee.
At what point or by what process does the fee or tax become imposed? Because it doesn't seem that simple. I mean, we're getting fuel from lots of places around the world. We're creating it ourselves. At what point is this carbon taxed?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are choke points in the supply system for all the fossil fuels. And so the fossil fuels we're talking about coal, we're talking about natural gas, and we're talking about oil, petroleum. Coal only comes from certain coal mines, or it comes in at the border. And so that's pretty easy. For natural gas, you have hundreds of thousands of, especially with the advent of fracking sites, but they go to compressor plants where you compress the natural gas, and there's only a handful of those. And then with oil, you may have lots of oil wells. Again, border is a consideration, but there are only a handful of refineries where that oil is separated into its component parts. Other interesting things that come from oil: asphalt comes from oil. All of our plastics pretty much come from oil. And so octane 8, as in octopus or octagon, there's 8 carbon atoms in oil. And so to get to the octane ratings that you find when at the pump, you need to distill that oil. So that's where it comes from, and that's where all these different things go. And when you add up those choke points in the system, the coal mine, the natural gas processing plant, or the oil refinery, you can get down to about 2,500 companies, places that would actually have to pay the fee or the tax. And guess what? They're already all paying some sort of fee or tax to the federal government. And so this is really the same employees that they already have on the fuels that they already understand the energy content. So it's a simple one additional calculation the same people can do to arrive at the carbon fee or carbon tax that is owed to the federal government. So that's why you can do it so quickly. And that's why you can get to so many of our emissions so easily, because of those choke points in the system we have right now.
That's very interesting. So it's not too far off then to say that it's just a simple updating of a number, because it looks like a lot of the processes or systems to be able to implement any of those 3 concepts already exist then in some capacity. Is that right?
That's largely correct. I will say that most cap and trade systems are not that simple.
Right, with the trade part. That adds a lot more complexity.
Right, that's at the power plant, which I didn't mention first. So those are power plants who are using those fuels, and so that is it's certainly more complex.
We'll get more into cap and trade in a bit, but another level I'd love to touch on is the social cost of carbon. This value, which is implemented by the federal government, has been provisionally updated at the outset of the Biden administration. And I know this might be a little bit outside your area of expertise, but could you maybe give us an overview of what the concept is and how it's used?
Economists have made many attempts to figure out how much each ton of CO2 emissions costs society. It does end up being quite complicated the way they try and arrive about this, especially since the worst effects of climate change that are going to cost the most money are into the future. And even the scientists who are finding those aren't sure about how likely they are. So with any social cost of carbon, there's a lot of uncertainty, but they do it anyway. And so the social cost of carbon is an effort to arrive at an estimate for that social cost of carbon. You need to know what the damages are. You need to know how expensive they're going to be decades into the future. And you need to make some assumptions about how much future generations will value early action compared to other ways of spending that money. And this is looped into what's known as the discount rate for the social cost of carbon. Everybody who estimates it is upfront saying the worst effects of climate are not included. So all social costs of carbon are low.
So can you tell us more about how the social cost of carbon plays a role in policy today? Is it right to say that it's really more of a tool than a policy?
The social cost of carbon already plays an important role in forming regulations. Right now in the United States, regulations must go through a cost-benefit analysis, and the benefits have to outweigh the costs. Otherwise, you can't do the regulation. The costs are and the benefits are estimated using the social cost of carbon. So the higher the social cost of carbon, the more aggressive you can be with your regulations, because the higher your estimated benefits will be.
And if I'm not mistaken, the social cost of carbon has been in use for quite some time now, since 2009. But when it comes to more substantial carbon policy, the United States is actually behind many other countries. Can you describe the international environment around carbon policy and carbon pricing? More specifically, I would like to know which countries are doing a great job and what are some things we can learn from them?
The fact is that there are 46 countries that have some sort of carbon price in place, either cap and trade, carbon tax, or both in a lot of places. And when you look at those 46 countries that have them, they are highly weighted to the wealthiest countries in the world. So just running down the list of the top 10 economies in the world. So number one is the United States, and we don't have one. China is number two. They have an emissions trading system. Japan has both a emissions trading system and a carbon tax. All the EU countries that I'm going to list, they are subject to the EU emissions trading system. Some of them also have something else, either a carbon tax, a price floor, or another emissions trading system. So Germany is number four. They have the EU ETS and a German ETS. ETS is emissions trading system. It's another way of saying cap and trade. The United Kingdom still under the EU ETS, but they have a price floor. So even if the European Union price is lower than that price floor, fossil fuels in the United Kingdom have to pay that, at least that floor price.
For our listeners, since this podcast was recorded, the UK is no longer under the EU ETS, but as of May 2021, began selling permits for their own emissions trading system.
India is the only other top 10 economy that doesn't have a national carbon price. But going back to the last administration, Narendra Modi did have a tax on coal when he first came into office, and he increased that. I believe it was in his second term. So even though India didn't have a carbon price on all fossil fuels, they did have a price on coal. France has both the EU ETS and a carbon tax. Italy has the EU ETS. Canada is very interesting. Canada is our largest trading partner. And they have a policy, every province is going to have a carbon price. And by 2030, 9 years into the future, every province is going to have a price of at least 170 Canadian dollars. That's about 130 US dollars. So for American companies that do trade with our largest trading partner, if Canada decides to, right now they're not doing that, demand accountability, where those American companies are going to have to pay for the emissions that they emit in the United States for that good in Canada, then by 2030, I mean, that could be 130 US dollar hit that they have in Canada. So that's an important consideration. And the last one, rounding out the top 10, is South Korea. So really, the rest of the world is already moving on this. For American businesses, they're going to have to be subject to carbon prices in our biggest trading partners in the near future. The EU, I mentioned, they have committed to including a they call it a carbon border adjustment mechanism. They switched the border and the carbon. And that would be put in place January 1st of 2023. And so that means that this Congress that we're in right now, the 117th, this is the only Congress that has the opportunity to level the playing field for American businesses in the EU. The EU is the largest single market outside the United States. So the largest foreign market available to the United States companies they're going to have some sort of border adjustment because they're going to have to pay if they want to sell in the EU. So I would say that there's that would be the first border adjustment mechanism. Right now, all these countries have been eating the costs. There's been no border adjustment. And I think that's because the largest economy in the world, the United States, has not been at the table. We've not been showing leadership. And I do think that that's kind of kept the cap on the ambition of these countries. I think that if the United States were at the table, we're up to speed with what the rest of the world is doing, I think that you'd see much more ambition in terms of the price, in terms of the caps.
And what do you mean by border adjustment?
The point of a border adjustment is to keep it even Steven equal with respect to emissions. And so whether you produce something here in the United States or you produce something in another country, wherever it is, different countries are going to have different emissions intensities. So you're going to have to produce more tons of CO2 just because of where they get their energy from. Maybe it's from a country that's more dependent on coal. Because of the actual production process, take steel, do they use an electric arc furnace or do they use a blast furnace? Electric arc is going to be much more efficient. So are there still production? Where does that get from? So it's counting that. It's using that. So the border adjustment it accounts for that properly. And if you have a larger carbon footprint, you have to pay for it. And so as goods come in, fair and equivalent priced if they've been produced in the United States. And as goods leave the United States, you rebate that because they might be going to a country that doesn't have a carbon price.
I'm curious, you obviously spend a lot of time talking to policymakers in your role. To what degree are policymakers in the US aware of successful climate policies in other countries? Is the United States so tied up in domestic concerns that it sort of lacks awareness as to what other countries are doing on this front?
I think that we lack awareness. I think that our members of Congress lack awareness. And I will say that that's not for a lack of trying. I mean, our volunteers go to the Hill on a regular basis, and they've been bringing this message. This is not new, what I'm sharing, the World Bank carbon pricing. There have been over 40 countries that have something for years. But it's not sinking in. And so even though our volunteers have been taking their own personal time, spending their own money to inform Congress on this very important issue, it's not sinking in. And so I do think that a lot of members of Congress would be very surprised at just how many other countries are using carbon pricing. I think they'd be very surprised at how far behind we are. And with these developments, with Canada's ambition, our largest trading partner, with the EU's commitment to having a border carbon adjustment by January 1st, 2023, I think that that's news, and I'm hopeful that will force their attention on this issue, and we'll get some serious policy making in the near future.
What would you say to policymakers in the US to explain the benefits of these policies and to help them avoid the mistakes that we've seen play out in other countries that have had them, implemented for some time?
Yeah, well, let's start with the positive. Let's start the benefits. And the whole point of all of this is to reduce emissions, and that is a clear benefit. These work. And so you do see emissions reductions. One thing that might be important is continuing ambition. And so you see emissions reductions while the price is increasing. Once it stagnates, people get a little bit lazy, and you see emissions reductions kind of plateau.
Can you give us an example of where we've seen this happen?
I think the best instance is probably British Columbia. They put a carbon tax on there. It was the Conservative government that did this. I think it was 2008. And they increased it for, I believe it was 4 years, up to a price of 30 Canadian dollars. And that there you did see it start to stagnate. So you saw the provincial economy was keeping pace with all the other provinces in Canada, if not doing a little bit better. And then you saw this, but they were doing much better in terms of emissions reductions per capita. And there's also some interesting data coming out on jobs. There was a 2017 study of the British Columbia carbon tax that returns most of the revenue to taxpayers, and it showed that over a 6-year period, job gains in labor-intensive sectors like healthcare outweighed job losses in energy-intensive sectors like air travel. There were actually more employment opportunities with the carbon tax than without it.
Who would have thought that having a carbon tax would be so profitable? there any policies that you know of that were intended to reduce emissions, but when they went into practice fell short of expectations?
Yeah, I think it's easiest to point to cap and trade. And again, going back to the purpose of these carbon prices is to reduce emissions. And the way you reduce emissions is by the price. It's not what you do with the revenue, it's by the price. And so in practice, in cap and trade systems, the price has not met with ambitions. And so when you set up the cap and the trading there, and especially if you have offsets and a safety valve, you don't have the prices that you need to really incentivize emissions reductions. And that has been a disappointment to the people who put them into place, because that was the whole goal, was to see emissions reductions.
So who is the opposition here? What's the lobby? Who are the lobbyists who oppose these ideas?
That calculation is shifting in a big way, because in the past year, even 6 months, you've seen some really significant statements from some of those opponents. So for example, the US Chamber of Commerce on January 19th, the day before Biden was inaugurated, said they want to see market-based policies. And their spokesperson, Marty Durbin, said that includes carbon taxes, that includes cap and trade. So Chamber of Commerce, biggest, it doesn't get any bigger than that in terms of business in the United States. They're saying this is a good idea. Even the American Petroleum Institute is saying not just market-based, but they said carbon price, that they want to see that. And I think that that's tied to, you look at GM saying they're only going to sell emissions-free vehicles after 2035, Volvo saying only 2030. Oil companies are going to have to become energy companies, otherwise they're not going to have anybody to sell their products to. So I think that you're seeing that shift manifest in their public statements. And then the last one I'll mention is the Business Roundtable, which had a very strong statement specifically for a carbon price, and that was late last year. You add that with the other countries and the increased ambition there, and there really is a substantial shift just in terms of who is opposing this and who is vocally supporting it, either in the public discussion or on the Hill.
Now, turning toward the implications of what you described earlier as a fee and dividend, there was a study done back in 2013 by a group called Regional Economic Models Incorporated, or REMI for short. And those that are listening, you can find the study at citizensclimateeducation.org/tools/REMI-report. And in this study, there were some pretty interesting findings in terms of job creation and impact on GDP that come about with a carbon fee and 100% dividend policy. Can you explain, what these findings were and the opportunities that are associated with this kind of policy?
Yeah, those were two surprising findings, that there was a slightly positive effect on GDP and there was job growth as a result of that policy they modeled. The other two findings that were, I would say, of great interest were, number one, just how quickly it reduced emissions, not necessarily a surprise, but still consistent with other models. And then the lives saved, tens of thousands of lives, avoided deaths each year by the end of the study period. And so, as I said at the beginning, public health was my entree into this, and so I was really excited to see that result. And the reason you saw those two findings that you highlighted, the job growth and the GDP growth, for the GDP, I would say that most subsequent research has found it's basically neutral. Basically neutral on GDP, maybe slightly negative, but roughly neutral. And the job growth, you see that in the EU, you see that in Canada, British Columbia in particular. And the reason there is, if you think about it, if you're doing oil exploration, you can spend $1 million just digging a hole to look for oil, and 9 out of 10 holes are dry.
Okay.
And if you think about that $1 million that you spent to do that, how many nurses could you hire in healthcare with $1 million? You could hire a lot. And so I think that really hires, to get fossil fuels, you've seen increasing efficiency. You need fewer actual people to do it. And you just need more, it's more energy intensive, it's more cost intensive. Mm-hmm. Whereas there's a lot of more labor intensive same amount of money leads to more jobs. And healthcare is one of those. The service industry is one of those, especially if you pair the carbon fee or tax with a dividend. You're putting more money into the pockets of especially low income, middle income, regular American households. Those are the ones who are most likely to spend that money and put it back into the economy. Mm-hmm. And so, especially if you do that, you see more spending on in sectors, in jobs that require more labor. Mm-hmm. And another, I think, issue that when people have looked at this, they focused on the fossil fuel jobs and those losses, and they don't look at the other places in the economy that are affected. And REMI was really good. It looks at, I think it's 70 different economic sectors, 70 different industries. And they have them paired together. And so when you do that, you really do discover this boost in food services with people having more money in their pocket. The hospitals, I mean, spending on healthcare is 1/6 of GDP in the United States. And so especially if you give people a dividend, it's not like they're spending this on getting health care for themselves, for their children, that they otherwise would not have because of the dividend. And you also asked about GDP. For the REMI study in particular, it's because of the border adjustment, the way they treated it. Most economic studies don't look at this, but they found that because the United States is relatively efficient, low carbon in our production, when you have that border carbon adjustment and you're demanding parity for emissions, U.S. companies actually did slightly better.
So the findings of this report tell us that with a fee and dividend, essentially oil-producing companies are paying fees, and then the proceeds of these fees are being distributed. But my question is, how are they being distributed, and is this distribution equitable?
First, the idea, and now that there's a bill was reintroduced. So the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, that is the bill that Citizens Climate Lobby volunteers have specifically been lobbying for since 2018. Before that, we had a carbon fee and dividend policy idea, not a bill because no member of Congress had introduced it. And all of these policies had the same rebate for every adult in the United States. And now in the versions that have been introduced into the United States Congress, they include a half share per child. And that's just because children live with their parents, and they're just not driving like parents are. And so
only very special children are driving trucks.
Very special children. Yes, exactly. The idea is that everybody has a stake. Everybody's involved in the solution. And so everybody has this incentive because they can see, this policy, that combination of fee plus dividend gives everybody a seed packet of carrots. So they can grow their own carrots and motivate themselves in all the ways that they want to reduce emissions in their lives. So everybody participates in the solution to this most important problem.
And as the price increases, what are those annual projections, year 1, year 2, and so on, in terms of number of dollars per month that family might see?
I think it's the estimate was $22 per adult, mm-hmm. and $11 per child. I think that's the year 1 estimate. So
and that's per month?
That's per month, yeah. Mm-hmm. And it grows. So I mean, at the end of 10 years, you're looking at, I think you're looking at 1,400. I'll have to get back to you on that. So it's a significant amount of money, especially for low-income households. And actually, your listeners can check out another tool we have. You can look up yourself how you would do. Enter just a small subset of variables like your zip code. How much you spend on your energy bill, what kind of house you live in, and you can get an estimate. If this policy were to be in place, given your costs, how much would you benefit by? So that's another way of involving people in the solution, even now while it's in the policy development. We're trying to convince policymakers to do it. That's the personal carbon dividend calculator.
And who's not gaining with a fee and dividend policy? Who are we leaving out?
The losers are the people who are most responsible for polluting the atmosphere. And so because it's so far upstream, anybody who uses more fossil fuels, they're going to be paying more, they're getting the same dividend back, and so they're actually going to lose money. And when you look at the United States, 61% of households end up ahead. You take the dividend, you subtract their costs, well over half, 61% of households end up ahead because this tends to benefit families, younger families with children. It's about 68% of individuals benefit. So you two-thirds of Americans benefit. There's another big chunk that basically break even. They're not really going to notice. The people who lose are going to be the biggest consumers of fossil fuels. These are going to be the wealthiest individuals in the United States. So the more money you have, the more you can spend. And over half of our emissions are actually embedded not in the fuel we put into our tank or when we turn on the lights, it's in the stuff we buy. And so if over half of our emissions are embedded in the stuff we buy, it's people who are wealthier. By definition, they can buy more stuff. By definition, they're going to have more emissions. But the thing about that is they're also the least likely to notice the difference. And so when you look at what the negative is as a percentage of their income, it's actually quite small. So looking at Americans, it's the wealthiest Americans who do the least well. If you look, let's see here. We also have a household impact study. And if you look at the household impact study, it's 96% of the lowest consumption quintile, those who are consuming the least, 96% benefit. If you look at quintile 2, 85% of quintile 2 benefits. If you look smack dab in the middle class, 68% of that middle quintile benefits. And quintile is, you take 100%, you divide it by 5 quintiles, so you get 20% chunks. So the middle quintile is the middle 20% from 40 to 60%.
We have this idea that if we take personal responsibility, like driving an electrical vehicle or turning off the lights or, not taking flights, that's doing our part. But I guess that's really a fallacy because over 50% of our emissions are happening intrinsically just by going out, living our lives, buying things because of how those things are made. So this policy seems to be really efficient and effective. It gets to where the problem is originating. I'd love to take sort of a left turn. What are the carbon policy levers that the Biden infrastructure plan would make use of, and to what degree? And then in particular, I'm very curious to hear about how you feel about that plan and what's included, such as the clean energy standard. I know that's sort of opposed to the idea of the carbon fee and dividend concept. Could you explain what that conversation is all about?
Sure. Yeah. The first thing I'll say about the Biden infrastructure plan is that there's still a lot of politics to happen between here and when something is passed. And what Biden put out is it's a detailed outline, but it's not a policy that is manifest anywhere in Congress. And Congress is the one that's going to have to pass this. So there's still a lot of details to be ironed out. There's still a lot of politics. What we've seen from Biden so far is basically pointing us in the direction where the debate is going to head, and it's the starting gun. So that being said, one thing I love about it is the ambition. I think that it is a very ambitious suite of policies, talking about trillions of dollars in investment, and which really is getting us into the right ballpark for what we need to do to address climate. The thing that I would like is a note for improvement, and this will be no surprise, is that it doesn't include a carbon price. There's no simple fee or tax in that.
Why is that? I'm just going to want to pause you. Why? I mean, we've been hearing about carbon price for a really long time. Lots of other countries do this. I'm sure, Biden himself is aware that many other countries do this, or maybe I shouldn't assume that. But why do you think it doesn't have a carbon price in there? What's the reason?
Politics. I mean, I think that there are political considerations. I think that Biden would like to put a price on carbon. I mean, he was for it on the campaign. He's got a lot of people in his administration, most notably Janet Yellen and John Kerry, who support this and are public about supporting a carbon price. I think that, Biden knows there's still a lot of politics to happen. So it's entirely possible that this is a calculation, not to bring it out now and to include it later. I don't know. I don't have the kind of access or knowledge to say that definitively. But I do think it boils down to politics. It has nothing to do with the efficacy of the policy, what he believes or the efficacy of the policy. It has to do with the specific political constellation we all find ourselves in now. Yeah, and you also mentioned the clean energy standard. That was a part of his proposal, and I'll say a clean energy standard is not mutually exclusive to a carbon price. You can do both at the same time.
Explain that. How does that work?
So a clean energy standard, first of all, it's just for the power sector. So it's not economy-wide like a carbon fee or tax can easily be. So you're talking about 27% of emissions. And what the clean energy standard would do is it would say, by this certain time, you must have a certain percentage of energy coming from what qualifies clean sources. And you would also have to define what clean sources are. And then
meaning the ultimate legislation, it puts the onus on the legislation that has yet to be worked out to define what we mean by clean sources. So it's really just sort of a concept.
Yeah, it puts off those hard decisions. The bite is in the future.
Right.
So it's far into the future, as opposed to the carbon fee. 9 months, you feel that bite. And so but they're not mutually exclusive. You can do both at the same time. So I mean that's why I prefer. I really want to see a carbon fee or tax in this, because it bites so quick. It gets those big emissions on the front end now, and emissions reductions now. That's lives saved. Lives saved not just because of the climate, because of all the co-pollutants as well. The NOx, the SOx, the mercury, the particulate matter, and particularly as we're in this moment as a country of reckoning with racial inequality and the effect that has, compounded with the coronavirus, really larger impacts in communities of color that have a larger cumulative impact. I care about that. I want to see those emissions go down quickly, and there's nothing that gets up and running, enforces accountability faster than a fee or tax. So I would really like to see that incorporated moving forward, for the speed and for the scale. 80% of emissions versus 27. In this context, I like 80 better than I like 27.
So let's talk about the environmental justice component of all of this. What kind of impact would a fee and dividend policy have on the emission of co-pollutants?
First of all, I just want to say that, people who have been working for decades for the cause of environmental justice for their communities, they should be involved in the policy-making discussion as early as possible. And I know that President Biden is already in contact with these groups, but given all the politics that I mentioned need to happen between now and then, absolutely people who represent EJ communities should be at the table discussing that and having their voices heard. But to your question, you would see a huge impact from a carbon fee or tax in the reduction of co-pollutants. So looking at those, I mentioned particulate matter, I mentioned NOx, that's nitrous oxide, SOx, that's sulfur dioxide, and mercury. Those basically, most of those in the country come from fossil fuels. And since the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act, for example, targets net zero by 2050, we're talking about essentially getting rid of the largest source of particulate emissions of all these co-pollutants by 2050. And you can't reduce fossil fuels without also reducing these emissions, because you look at these, the particulates that's imperfectly combusted oil or natural gas or it's coal, imperfectly combusted. So if you stop combusting it, you get rid of those. And again, the speed is really important. The longer that you are exposed, the more you are exposed to these pollutants, the higher your risk. So we want to get to cleaner as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And I just don't see anything that reduces more emissions quicker than a straightforward fee or tax.
So how much are we paying in healthcare costs for like asthma and preventable diseases because we're continuing to use fossil fuels?
Actually, Jerry Hinkle, one of our research coordinators, did a presentation earlier this week, and he highlighted this question. And thanks to recent research, you're talking about avoiding the medical costs are easier than the climate costs, but by the 10th year of this policy, you're talking about $968 billion in avoided healthcare costs per year. And so it goes up as time goes on because you reduce more and more. So about $1 trillion of benefit, health benefits, lives saved, work days not missed due to illness, children who aren't suffering from asthma, and estimating that's basically $1 trillion by 10 years out.
I really like the sound of kicking carbon butt and saving lives. Danny, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
That was Dr. Daniel Richter from Citizens Climate Lobby speaking with us about a variety of climate and energy policy levers to help us decarbonize the American economy and create jobs and growth in the process.
For more on climate policy, you can check out the video on the topic on our website. There you can also find other interviews, watch our other videos, and sign up for our newsletter at climatenow.com. And if you want to get in touch, email us at contact@climatenow.com or tweet at us at WeAreClimateNow. We hope you'll join us for our next conversation.